Thank you. My name is Kelly Sims Gallagher. I am the Dean of the Fletcher School up the road at Tufts University. But this is also a second home to me. I'm on the board of the Belfer Center here at the Kennedy School, did my pre- and postdoctoral fellowship here, and was on the faculty for a few years before returning to Fletcher. So it's great to be back. My own background is on Chinese industrial policy in the clean tech domain. I've also worked in more recent years on climate policy, and we have an incredible panel today on automobiles, the autonomous and electric vehicle challenge, a subject that I am very interested in and is near and dear to my heart. We have three fantastic panelists, and I'm just going to say a brief word about each of them, and they may add a few other contextual comments about themselves when they speak. So our first paper is going to be Ilaria Mazzocco, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow, the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Our second panelist is Elaine Buckberg, who is the Senior Fellow at Harvard's Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability and formerly was Chief Economist of General Motors. And our third panelist is Kristin Vekasi, the Mansfield Chair of Japanese and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the University of Montana. So terrific panel. I just wanted to do a little scene setting, having read their papers in advance, to bring in some of my maybe more historical background, which I think Chris, as a historian, will appreciate. So all three papers relate to kind of the interplay between the United States and China. And I think that's just a general theme of the conference. And I was sort of there at the beginning in China, of the very beginning of the electric vehicle industry, and even before that, because my doctoral work was on the development of just the plain old auto industry in China. And I was living in China in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which was really just the very beginning of the auto industry. And I was originally interested in the extent to which China was acquiring cleaner automobile technology, and was shocked to find out that they weren't at all acquiring anything, not catalytic converter technology, not electronic fuel injection technology. There was nothing clean about the automobiles that were being produced in China at that time. So then I started to try to understand why, and I studied the three US-China joint ventures, Beijing Jeep, Shanghai GM, Chang'an Ford. And I tried to understand the technology transfer process and the incentives that were kind of embedded in that joint venture structure. And I would say that, like, my lesson was there were no incentives. I mean, that's sort of the main finding. The Chinese weren't asking at the time for cleaner vehicle technology. And the foreign firms, and this was not only the US firms, were not offering it either. And they were not compelled to do it because there were no policies in place at the time that would require the use of, say, catalytic converter technology. And then later, perhaps partly because of the findings of my dissertation, which I had shared with the Chinese government, they imposed their first fuel economy standards in the year 2000 and their first pollution control standards, which were very behind where the US was at the time. And then subsequently, we did see technology transfer to China through this joint venture structure. And at the time, the entire automobile industry was locked into a joint venture structure. That was the method that the Chinese government had adopted to try to learn from foreign firms, was to tie all of their existing state-owned enterprises up into joint ventures and to learn through the technology transfer process. And it turned out they didn't learn very much. interestingly, I'm now fast forwarding to this sort of dawn of the electric vehicle industry because they hadn't learned very much, and because Toyota, which held all the patents around hybrid electric vehicle technology, was refusing to license its hybrid electric vehicle technology to Tianjin at the time, they decided to adopt an electric vehicle pathway. And actually, here at Harvard, in this room, we held a series of dialogues with the expert group that was advising the Ministry of Science and Technology at the time about technology pathways that the Chinese could take. And we had a series of dialogues here and in China about technology pathways for clean vehicles and about technology pathways for clean coal. And there was a heated debate at the time in that experts group between fuel cell vehicles, hybrid electric vehicles, and electric vehicles. And the chief expert at the time was a man named Wang Gang, and he later became known as the father of electric vehicles in China. But he actually was a proponent of fuel cell vehicles. He had trained at Audi in Germany, and that was Audi's chosen pathway at the time. He later became the Minister of Science and Technology. He was notable for being one of the only ministerial appointments who was not a member of the Communist Party. He was a long-term minister who really oversaw the transformation in China to electric vehicles. But I'd also like to note that most of the electric vehicles we see today in China were developed by private companies, not state-owned, the traditional state-owned enterprise. And so I think that's a very interesting part of the story that I think is often misunderstood because people assume that these are largely state-owned enterprises. Many of them are partially state-owned at the local level, but they're not the original large state-owned enterprises, centrally state-owned enterprises. Okay, so with that scene setting, that brings us to today. And I just want to say, my second book, which was on the globalization of the clean energy industry, which I researched in 2010, so 15 years ago, the Chinese at that time were not capable of producing their own batteries for electric vehicles. So I just want to put that in context because when I was doing my doctoral work, that was maybe 30 years ago, I'm dating myself. At that time, they were just beginning the auto industry, period, right? And 15 years ago, they were not capable. One of my case studies in that book was on electric vehicle batteries, and they were not capable of producing electric vehicle batteries at that time on their own. So in 15 years, as you will see, China has completely risen, I guess, is a good way to describe it, and arguably is conquering global markets. So I think it's important to understand that story and think about how other countries and companies can compete in this very difficult context. Okay, so now I want to turn the floor over to Ilaria, and you're going to do the first talk. And I'm going to be standing and sitting because I have a herniated disc in my back, and sitting is hard for me. So ignore me when I stand up. Go ahead, Ilaria, take it away.
Thank you, Kelly. And I should say Kelly's books are excellent to this day on all these topics. And I would urge anyone who's interested, especially sort of the evolution of China's automotive industry, to take a look at the book that she wrote based on her dissertation. Very, very interesting. But I think, thank you for that. I think it really provided sort of the background for what I'm going to talk about. So when I got the call from Chris inviting me to this, he said, I want you to talk about how China got to be the EV leader it is today. So I'm going to focus mostly on that. I'll try and touch, if I have enough time, on some more research I've been doing on how Chinese OEMs that are now going global and implications, both for the rest of the world and for Chinese. Well, if I don't get to it, please ask questions on it. I have the charts up here and also later. Turned it off. Yes, sorry, I apologize. Apologies. But there was sort of a fertile ground for this industrial policy to take off, right? And I think that's worth noting that, for example, the fuel cell vehicle example, the same policies that were put in place for EVs, right? These were called new energy vehicles. That category included fuel cell vehicles. Those went nowhere, right? It was just not the right ecosystem, and it was also the wrong timing, I think, in some ways, right? So when you start seeing the first policies to commercialize EVs in China around 2010 for passenger vehicles, 2009 for buses, the technology was mature enough that you could actually envision this jump to consumers. It was also a time when there wasn't enough, global competition to make it impossible to enter and then become, more important or, dominant these days, I think we would say. And I think, actually, to the credit of other governments, China wasn't the only one that realized this, right? So if you go and look at the history of EV policy, a lot of other governments were doing or looking at this industry as well. In fact, if you look at the famous Tesla DOE loan, that was in 2010, right? The difference was how this was approached and the continuity in the policy, right? So China had a more comprehensive, industry-wide approach where provinces and, sometimes even municipalities were really empowered and actually tasked to target this industry, which then created sort of a multi-player and multi-sort of level and multi-segment sort of ecosystem. This also helped scale, right? So the scale was quite significant. I'm going to do something that's probably bad practice and jump around my slides. Oh, I think, sorry. So this is just to give you a sense of the scales, right? These are cars sold in each country, right? So if you look at last year, 11.5 million EVs, that includes both battery electric and plug-in hybrids, were sold in China. If you look at the year-to-date in August of this year, in Europe, the European Union, which is, if you take all the 27 countries, is the largest market for EVs, it was 12 point, let's say 0.5, it was less than that. So I think that gives you a sense, right? In 15 years, just 1 million more cars were sold in the entire European Union compared to last year in China. Right, so that scale has been very important because, of course, it gives huge economies of scale to these companies, but it's also enabled innovation because of the nature of technology. Right, we talked about jet engines in the previous session. Jet engines work very differently, right? You can't have that scale doesn't give you the same sort of advantage. When we're talking about batteries specifically or cars, you learn a lot. Each unit you produce gives you new insight into the next one, and you can have gradual improvements, and you can then reduce costs, etc. All these things give you a long-term advantage, and I think that's been really central to this game. Entrepreneurial companies, and I think this is a point that Kelly was sort of hinting at. You had a lot of actually private players that are typically the most dynamic companies in China. They're really interested in this. So even today, when you look at the most successful players in the EV field in China, it's BYD, it's Geely, right? These are not state-owned companies. And the state-owned company that's done the best is SAIC, which is a Shanghai firm that's been fairly sort of innovative as well. But I think if you look even at the battery segment, it's often private players as well. And so I think that's there was very responsive companies that were willing to play with the government and often actually worked with the government to develop policies. There were adversarial moments, but I think on the whole, there was a very collaborative sort of environment because this was seen as generally to the advantage of some key players. The last point that I think gets overlooked sometimes is that actually international ties were quite important as well. This is actually not the result of indigenous innovation, right? None of these technologies were invented in China. And actually, foreign players were quite important in a lot of segments. You had foreign consulting firms that helped work with Chinese OEMs to improve the quality of the cars. You had companies like Tesla coming to China and opening factories. You have now foreign OEMs that are investing in Chinese startups to acquire that technology or doing R&D in EVs in China because it is so much more advanced. So I think that continues. I think there's also an untold story of policy transfer and policy learning in China from abroad, right? So a lot of the policies China adopted actually came from California or the United States. They were just taken to a whole other level in China. I think if you flip through the blue books, right, which is sort of an anthology of policy, sort of studies for policymakers in China, they had case studies, right? The sort of business case studies from abroad that they were studying of like what worked and what didn't work in like France or whatever, right? And so I think there was a lot of learning from abroad as well. So this wasn't, just something that came out of nowhere, but it was operating in sort of a global environment. So I think, if we're thinking about what works in industrial policy, those are all things to consider. Just sort of a timeline here. There was R&D support that goes back to at least 2001, right? The free verticals and free horizontals framework goes back at least to 2001, and that was, those were R&D grants that were being given to companies as well as labs in batteries, electric drive systems, motors and controls, as well as EVs, plug-in hybrids, and fuel cell vehicles, right? So I'm not saying this was like massive, but it was there, right? And some companies like BYD actually benefited quite a bit from this. Before 2009, you had some sort of demonstration programs, but really, it's 2010 when, especially for passenger vehicles, you start seeing policies to create a market and help companies reach that market. And this is really driven by local governments. By 2015, it's clear that it's successful in getting cars to consumers, which often aren't necessarily private consumers. They're fleets, there's taxing companies as well. But the quality is not great, and the costs are starting to ramp up. So the central government steps in. Obviously, policies have been developed like a couple of years before being implemented. And this is when you actually start getting requirements on companies, right? They actually have to meet certain types of standards for the battery, right? The battery density needs to be a lot better. They need to have better quality, and the subsidies start being cut. And there's announcements that each year it's going to be reduced, and you have to meet certain levels to receive certain levels of subsidies, certain levels of quality, right? And then after 2019, you actually have local government subsidies first being phased out, and then central government subsidies. These are consumer subsidies, by the way, that get cut as well. And it gets replaced with what's called dual credit policy. This is based on the zero emission vehicles credit system out of California, except that in China, it doesn't work like a market. It just works like telling everybody make EVs, right? And so this leads to a huge competition, which is great for adoption, it turns out, right? It turns out when you put all these cars in front of consumers, consumers like them, and China starts buying, right? That's the chart I showed earlier, like, millions of cars start getting bought in China. It also leads to eventually the problem that we have today that the government has termed as involution, right? So falling costs, falling margins, rather unsustainable competition, and eventually the risk of less R&D happening in this sector as well, right? So I think that's the concern, and it's also pushed Chinese companies to go abroad to look for higher margins outside of China, and that's the trend that we're seeing right now. But I think this is just to give you a sense, right, the types of tools that we're talking about. We have local governments that do all kinds of things, right? So very active local governments, and they remain quite active to this day. We have the sort of demand side subsidies. Those are gone at this point, right? You have supply side subsidies for manufacturers, and those, again, that's the sort of usual package you get for manufacturers in China. Some are more distorted than others, right? You have regulatory support, you have financing, right? Access to credit. You have government guidance funds, which actually are becoming more active, in my understanding, on the battery industry, which I think is becoming more and more of a priority, strategic priority for the Chinese government. You have sort of direct grants, right? Tax credits, et cetera. And those can happen at local level and central level as well. The others are more typical, I think, in other countries as well. So I'm not necessarily going to go over them, but I think that's generally some tools to keep in mind. And this is, again, these are the consumer subsidies and how they declined. To give you a sense of what this chart means is, if you lived in Shenzhen in 2010, 10 or 11 and you were buying an electric vehicle, you were like one of like scores of people doing that, right? There were very few people doing that, and with good reason. You could get up to like basically $16,000, right? Because you were getting subsidies from the local government and the national government. By 2023, or rather 2022, you were only getting maybe up to $1,500, right? So it goes down quite dramatically over time. This is the scale I'd already showed you. I think, I know I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just very quickly, I mean, why are we talking about this? It's because we've had this massive ramp up in sales. This is number of vehicles, not value. If you look at it by value, it's different. China doesn't rank quite as highly. But I think, if you look at it differently, you just see that there's been a massive scale. This is by value. In sales. And a lot of those are actually internal combustion engine vehicles, right? And that's actually the result of the transition in China, which has been so quick that a lot of automakers have been fully unprepared for it. So a lot of the internal combustion engine vehicle exports are actually Western OEMs that can't sell in China anymore, and so they're exporting more. And a lot of those cars are going to emerging markets. And that's creating a whole new layer of complexity, because if you look, for example, at the G20, every country that's categorized as middle income that's in the G20 has an automotive sector, and they care a lot about it, right? It's a job creator, it's a GDP creator. And so this is, some new competition happening. EVs are obviously increasing, and ICE vehicles, we'll see if they peak or not, but it's not quite looking like we're there yet. So it looks even more skewed towards ICE vehicles if you look at it by numbers, right? So the value of the average EV is higher than the ICE vehicles. This is only through 2024, but I think, the trends are fairly clear that, increasingly you're seeing a lot of these cars going to Asia and Latin America. I think I'll stop there just to show you how diversified all this is. I think I'll stop here, but I'll say one thing. One thing that emerged that's to keep in mind is that we don't know exactly how this is going to play out in the long term. A lot of Chinese companies are now making investments around the world, both in Europe and in emerging markets. We don't know how much localization is actually going to happen, right? How much of the value chain is going to stay in China? Is this going to tie countries more to China, or is it going to lead to more diversification? A lot of that depends on industrial policy outside of China, right? And how that plays out. There's also a real question about, exports to more developed countries has actually been a driver of innovation for Chinese companies traditionally. If they're starting to export to countries that are poorer than China, is that still going to be the same driver of innovation, right? So I think there's a lot of questions about what this means in the long term, but it's clear that we're going to see a lot more Chinese cars or Chinese-made cars, right? Because there's also, and I just, sorry, here, this is 2023, you still had Tesla as the largest exporter from China. In 2025, it's mostly BYD, right? So you've seen like a big dramatic change. And so, but there's still, those Western companies are still exporting from China. And that's because there's, it's so, the ecosystem in China is so competitive that they want to make them there. So I think there's just like a lot of questions, and I know I went over time, so I'll stop right there. But
all right, you did absolutely great. Lot of information conveyed in a short amount of time. I want to add one piece of the story that I think is relevant as we think about the US, which is just the charging infrastructure. Because I remember in those early days when they were throwing subsidies at the consumers and there was weak uptake. So that was very surprising because there was all this money being offered to consumers and they were saying no to all the money. It was because they were so worried about charging infrastructure. And then there was this national effort to really get a charging infrastructure in place, which the United States has still not, managed to achieve. And then that really was enabling. And then you could see that very rapid decline in the consumer subsidies. Okay, great. Our next presentation is loaded up. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Elaine.
Tough being in auto. You have really narrow margins.
I don't think you're.
I am on. I am green. Green.
She's more with it than
Can I have a
me.
handheld?
It's okay.
Okay. All right. It's tough being in auto. Again, you have really narrow margins. You have super complex supply chains. There's always a supply chain problem. Your capital investment is really substantial to get your product off the ground. So engineering plus build out just in an existing plant, new like update of a product, hundreds of millions to billions. Not the chip numbers, not the we just saw, but pretty high. When you're developing EVs and autonomous vehicles or autonomous technology to go on existing vehicles, that's even higher, substantially higher. Major new technology development. Historically, the automakers have been global. They're on 2, 3, 4 continents. And recently, your two biggest markets, the US and China, have rules that don't necessarily let you share technology across the same vehicle being offered in 2 different continents or developing autonomous vehicles across the 2. And then add volatile policy. So here's just one article. This one ran in the journal on Sunday. Okay, so it's saying, okay, you got supply chain issues, different kinds, rare earth metals, minerals we've talked a lot about already, we'll talk about more, but total bans, aluminum, just an ordinary big fire. Semiconductors, there's another geoeconomic issue involving a Netherlands-based chip supplier that was producing in China. Oh, and then there are the tariffs. It estimates that the tariff costs could be about $12 billion. And then with the easing of policies that would have driven demand towards EVs, you know, my former employer, GM, took a $1.6 billion charge. A lot of challenges. Now, for auto, industrial policy really never went out of style. So the ones here are just those that have been enforced in the last 20 years. So the chicken tax, I know that says 1964, it's still there. That's a tariff on light-duty trucks. It's one, but not the only driver of the fact that full-size pickups are mostly by the Detroit 3 automakers, and even Toyotas are made here. 2009, we had quite an array, starting with the bailouts that we were talking about earlier, and the creation of the Loan Programs Office, Cash for Clunkers, EV tax credits, Loan Programs Office, all in ARA, the Recovery Act, led to loans to 3 of our big automakers. USMCA and NAFTA before it, largely managed trade in autos. That's what that's all about. The IRA had many different industrial policies associated with EVs. We'll get into that a bit. And then in 2024, tariffs were put on Chinese EVs at a whopping 100% in lithium-ion batteries. But today I'm going to argue is different. And you might notice that my cover slide, my title is actually different on the agenda. It's driving security with a question mark because I didn't really know where I would land. But I will say that I think that today, you know, historically industrial policy has been rejected by economics, including national security arguments. But I'm going to argue that today is a little bit different because one, that international playing field of what policies are being done and how you respond is different, and the Chinese government is truly pervasively involved in its EV industry. And secondly, it's developed this monopoly position in EV supply chains. And I'll remind you, monopoly doesn't mean you have 100% market share, although it approaches that in some, but a truly dominant market share. Chinese EVs and battery subsidies have vastly exceeded the US's, and they took off far earlier. So this article by Brian Deason and others at MIT CEPR tries to estimate the value of subsidies across countries, but in China, they try to get at the value of the below market government equity investments and credit. And you can see that both in dollars and in percentage of GDP, which are the dots, China was in there earlier. It was, and it's spent far more. And to this battery point, as some of you heard me mention last night, in 2018, China said, oh, by the way, you want to get any of those subsidies? The batteries need to be Chinese. So it really drove demand. And that is an industry, which, as Ilaria said, has huge learning benefits in terms of efficiency. And China dominates this downstream EV battery supply chain. And I know that Kristin's largely going to address this, but anywhere you see red on these graphs, that is China's market share, and especially in that processing area, right? It's a dominant share in most of these metals. And if you get to rare earths, it becomes even more dramatic. So I would argue that these national security arguments are more relevant today than they were in the past. And it's a few different reasons. One, it's that Chinese dominance of the supply chains for critical minerals and rare earths, and it's really in the refining part more than the sourcing. Two, it's that vehicles are basically computers on wheels at this point, and it does, or it has the potential to make them into spyware. So there are cameras all over them, especially for the use of autonomy, where cameras are one of the major tools. And then there are cybersecurity issues. So China, by the way, in about 2018 or 2019, said basically created a break in development of autonomous vehicles because anything you did in China couldn't be shared outside of China. And that was partly because of imaging and cameras. And cybersecurity, historically with an all-mechanical sedan, there was no concern that there would be a way to stop all vehicles in the tracks, but those are realistic concerns. And then third, it's true, auto manufacturing can translate to defense capabilities. And so if you do not know or recall this, in World War II, all the auto plants stopped making vehicles and they made planes. That's Ford's Willow Run facility. And at the beginning of COVID, when you needed more ventilators, who got the call? Mary Barra at GM, and then from a ventilator maker, because you're experts in manufacturing. And that resulted in the federal government demanding that both GM and Ford make ventilators. So in an economy with less manufacturing and less heavy manufacturing than we had back in World War II, auto might be one of your places that is most capable of scaling. Now, both the Biden and the Trump administrations leaned on national security. Jake Sullivan was in the room before, but he is not right now. But so after IRA, which is really an industrial policy law in so many ways, climate and industrial policy, Jake Sullivan as national security made a speech at Brookings that really laid out how the Biden administration thought about industrial policy. So first of all, who's making that speech? It's a national security advisor, not a senior economic official. And secondly, right, he says it's got to be foundational to economic growth, strategic from a national security perspective, and that private industry on its own is not going to make the investment. So one of the three prongs is national security. And the Trump administration repeatedly uses Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which is a national security argument for tariffs, including the auto and parts tariffs. And the Biden administration used a bunch of different carrots and sticks to drive EV adoption, trying to create this virtuous cycle between climate benefits, getting more EVs on the road and avoiding emissions, but also developing a domestic EV industry. And I'm going to say that in terms of sort of your industrial policy and driving economic activity, that these two aspects, the tax credits to drive demand by reducing the price wedge between EV and ICE vehicles, and the production tax credits for critical mineral processing and battery production are sort of the two most important, maybe from that growth perspective. Now, to understand the tax credits, there was a tax credit before. It was the first 200,000 vehicles made by any automaker, 7,500, could come from anywhere. The tax credits on IRA, really thanks through last minute provisions thrown in by Senator Joe Manchin to get his vote, were up to 7,500, two credits. Number one, you need North American assembly. Number two, you need North American battery components, increasing percentages that go up to 100% and quickly allows zero China content. And North American or allied critical minerals, same thing, increasing percentages, no China content by 2025. Now, for a second, like what happened? EV sales grew. Automakers tried to rework their critical mineral and battery supply chain so they'd be eligible for the purchase tax credit. If not, they shoved sales through the lease channel, which didn't have any of your origin, income, or price caps. And then there are real changes that we can look at about investment. So here, fantastic website, The Big Green Machine by Jay Turner at Wellesley, looks at different green investments. And here is quarterly capital investment announcements in EVs. Well, so there was a lot before. There was a lot of anticipation that IRA or Build Back Better would require North American or US manufacturing or assembly. But not that, you know, IRA after it continues, but doesn't really go up. But look at battery plant investment. A lot of those battery provisions were not foreseen. They were a surprise at the last minute from those last minute negotiations. And you can see that after IRA passes, that battery plant investment picks up considerably, and by the way, it goes heavily into red states as an attempt at ensuring this. So I think we could say that there are at least certain successes that we could measure in an industrial policy that largely is no longer there. But so Trump's auto policy so far. So first I'll take away almost every form of support for EVs. That's your first column here. But you're keeping that battery and critical mineral production tax credit because that is so heavily in red congressional districts. And you're keeping $5 billion for highway fast chargers. You're adding tariffs. And if you're an auto, this is like, it's hitting you everywhere. It's autos, it's parts, it's steel, it's aluminum. Those are big components. And the auto and parts tariffs really vary a lot by country, right? So here, if it's a non-USMCA auto coming from Canada or Mexico, it's 50 or 60%. But if it's coming from the UK, that's negligible. 10%. If it's coming from the EU, it's 15%. And if it's an EV coming from China, when you stack all the tariffs, it's 135% before any potential additional increase that go on November 1. So how would we evaluate the Trump policy? It's too early to do so, but I would say over time, I'm going to look at US auto production and sales. What's the unit and what's the share of US sales? I would look at parts production. Here, you'd have to really look at value and adjust for inflation. I would look at whether we were staying at the technological frontier. The world's going into EVs. If we stay behind in internal combustion engine vehicles or have less autonomous features, it's probably not a good thing. What's happening to auto jobs? There's a huge political romance around auto jobs that is not necessarily shared by workers. Now, one way that we might be more price competitive is if we automated vastly more. We gave up the political romance, we got the domestic production. China is really a leader in this with minimal to no workers. That could really help level the playing field on costs. And I would say quality adjusted what's happening for prices. Are we just driving up costs and driving down quality? Now, there's this narrative that's really dominant right now, like China's going to take over auto, especially EVs. There's real risk there, but I think it's possible the US can hold its ground and possibly even win. And I think that much more targeted auto industrial policy would be helpful and less expensive. So one, I think leapfrogging is possible. And I'll just ask you to put yourself back about 4 years and ask if you thought BYD would be beating Tesla in global markets. And about 3 years ago, having a Tesla in China was the highest status symbol you could get. The linchpins here for EV development are batteries and critical minerals and rare earths, I would argue. In batteries, this is a huge technological race. So invest in research, solid state, new chemistries, commercializable solid state's what we need. Critical minerals and rare earths, diversify storage thing. Maybe we should be more like OPEC shares. Develop lower cost and less environmentally damaging processing that would make it more feasible to do in the US, politically feasible, battery recycling to reduce the need for new sourcing. I think EVs still matter. I think it's the technology of the future. And inducing demand can help us scale and become efficient. And if we wait too long and stay further behind China and Europe, it'll be hard to ever catch up. And then design policy to phase out. Don't give a permanent subsidy or you'll never get to competitiveness. Thank you.
Yeah, just as a transitional comment, because this is really nice, we're going to move into the critical mineral supply chain. Just a comment is note the inconsistency in policy in the United States and the challenge that creates for the private sector as compared with a more predictable policy in the Chinese case. though they did phase down those subsidies really quickly, but they could because the costs were falling so fast. So, okay, we're gonna now turn to Chinese dominance in critical mineral supply chains. Over to you, Kristin.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for these great talks. So, in my 10 minutes here, I'm going to pull us back a little bit to the materials and the beginning of the supply chain. In 2009, I spent my first summer in China, and I was doing some work with an economist and really thinking about Japanese companies in China and all the sort of political risk management. And she says to me, "You should really pay attention to rare earths." Will do. As I continued that research in the fall of 2010 is when rare earths really started to hit the national news, and I was fortunately well positioned to really think about that. The rare earths, of course, have really hit the news in the last couple of days. It was exciting to make these slides as things were moving. If you wanted to really make good money on the stock market, you may have already hit it, but no financial advice here. But right now, rare earths are booming, both in the news and in the stock markets. And in large part, of course, this is because of the rare earth restrictions that we see from China in the last couple of weeks. But we're going to step back and sort of see a little bit how we came here and what lessons we can learn from that for thinking about EV supply chains, battery supply chains, et cetera, right? So really step back. So mineral supply chains, again, we're going to think about rare earths here, but this is a common story across many commodities, that they are geographically concentrated, and that China does control a lot of mining in many of these minerals. It is a resource abundant country, but more than the mining, it really is the processing and the refining of the commodities that matters. So rare earths is right here at the top. The pink bars there show controls of global mining and global processing for these different commodities. And these are a variety of commodities, including many that are core in electric vehicle and other supply chains, magnet supply chains. Asset ownership, just really quickly, is also geographically concentrated, but less so. So we do actually see a different kind of proportions of investment globally in these commodities, and when we look at that's different than mining and processing. So we can come back to that later if we wish. So when we saw these restrictions get placed on rare earth exports and also magnet exports, this was something that should have not been surprising. This is neither unexpected, nor is it going to be something that is simple to overcome. So I'm not going to walk through the entire history, but I'll point out that we started to see export restrictions on rare earths in around 2005, 20 years ago. And in 2010, this is a photo here of a Chinese fishing trawler running into a Japanese Coast Guard ship outside some contested maritime territories. Following that, Japanese companies started to report that they were unable to import rare earths from China. Now, this was not a coordinated central policy from the Chinese government, but it was experienced as export restrictions by Japanese companies. And Japanese companies and the Japanese government perceived this as coercive economic statecraft and responded as such. That was 15 years ago. Following this, there have been more, right? There's a WTO case, there are more export restrictions. And then starting in the summer of 2023, we started to see far more pervasive and systematic export controls and regulations placed on a variety of critical minerals, including rare earths, of course, in the last week, far more restrictive rare earth and magnet technologies that might do that. So China has this lockhold, right, on these commodities that have an exciting names. We like to think about them, right? Rare earths, they're neither earths nor rare. They can be found all around the world. But China does have this near monopoly. And so how did we get here? So the Chinese strategy, as I think about it, has really three different prongs. The first, and this will be familiar with other things that we've heard today, is that there's early and continuous investment in research and human capital. So starting in the 1950s and 60s, rare earth institutes were established in China, particularly in Inner Mongolia and southern China, near where the really abundant deposits of rare earths were found. But then in the 1980s, state labs were established in Beijing that really focused on the development of rare earth technology and people who have expertise in rare earth, human capital. And so we've had, along with that, there were newsletters and basic research to industry pipelines established through the transfer of information. At this point, it's very important to point out that this was not an innovative policy that China was following. Indeed, they were directly emulating what the United States had done in the post-war era, where we had these exact same programs. We had the Rare Earth Information Bulletin. We were doing these same kinds of policies in the US, but we had stopped by the late 1970s. The second strategy, strategy that China pursued is eventual firm consolidation and vertical integration. So in the 1980s and 90s, when rare earth production did start to shift towards China, and then in the 90s is when they really took it over, there were, and again, this might sound familiar, many small firms, many of them were unlicensed and illegal. The conditions were terrible. There was lots of pollution, a lot of really horrible labor conditions. And starting in 2010, 11, 12, China did start to consolidate, try to shut down a lot of this illegal mining, and to consolidate the firms into these mega firms. So today, the Chinese rare earth industry is dominated by two state-controlled firms, one in the north, one in the south, and those are end-to-end from research, basic research and development, all the way through refining, processing, separating the 17 metals, getting them to be market ready. So vertical integration here really has locked in the advantages of scale, and it's locked in a lot of coordination advantages. Might that lead to inefficiencies? Perhaps. We can bring that up in the Q&A if we wish. Third are different policy tools, and many of these are external. So there are pricing policies, the use of export quotas, environmental regulations that have converted the larger market shares into more structural power. So I'll show you a little bit of pricing data in a minute, but I do want to point out that some of these policy tools have very much shifted over time. In the 1990s, a lack of a strong regulatory environment and terrible environmental conditions did enable China to do this more cheaply. And we might think of this as predatory pricing. I think this is an advantage, an ugly advantage of the market. That is no longer what is happening in China. And China is no longer competitive globally in rare earths because they are just destroying the environment. The advantage of the Chinese commodity markets now very much more lies in number 1 and 2 on this rather than a weak regulatory environment. So not that didn't exist, but we are in a different situation now. So if we think about a few different ways we could measure this, this is some patent data. We can see this goes from 94 to 2024, and actually I think this one might go to 25, but the counts are very low still for the 2025 data. So patents that are published in China, you can see that China has almost 100% of rare earth related patents. Those are not necessarily patents that are globally competitive. If we look at the ones that are filed in that way, it's a much smaller percentage, but we can also see that there's been a lot of growth over time. Where are these patents focusing? We can see that they are focusing in there are other categories, of course, but things like magnets and motors in the basic research of the separation and processing, the mining technology. And even when we look at the more internationally competitive kinds of the priority only patents, there we see the Chinese patents in the sort of teal color really gaining on the rest of the world. So it's not that the United States and Japan in particular don't have strong intellectual property in, say, permanent magnets. There is. However, a lot of that has moved towards China and is going to continue moving that way even more. This is also because China has heavily invested in, again, in human capital. So I don't have a one-to-one comparison, unfortunately, to share with you because the data is very difficult to compare. But for example, looking at geosciences in the United States, there are between 600 and 650 PhDs given every year. In those fields. So right, these are people, not all of those are rare earth related at all, right? But that's our annual, and they're of course not, all of those folks won't stay in the United States. In China, there are two institutes for geosciences. There's one branch in Beijing, one branch in Wuhan that focus specifically on geosciences. And in between just those two institutions, there are about the same number of PhDs given every year. China has a deep bench, deep expertise in all of these fields. And in the United States, we have not kept up with these basic building blocks in order to try and rebuild this industry. Actually move on from that, absolutely. So last point of we should have seen this coming. Okay, so these are countries that have, by 2024, adopted critical mineral policies. Now, some of these countries only did so in the last few years, in 2020, but some of them, including the United States, did so right around after 2010. Clear policies to say, we know this is an issue. We made a list of the ones we know are national security threats, and rare earths are on 85% of those lists. We knew this was an issue. The United States is actively considering or been pursuing industrial policy since 2010. But it's not that we didn't identify this and talk about it, it just didn't work. And in part, that is because, again, apropos of an earlier conversation, Molycorp, the former owner of the big rare earth mine in the United States, did ask for a bailout and from the Department of Energy, and the US government said no. And they said no because it was a non-innovative company that said, you know what, if the market says you failed, we're going to let you fail. So that decision was made then, and now it is being rebuilt through MP Materials, which again, the US has an equity stake in now. We have many projects happening across the United States, both in mining and in post-processing. You can see some of these are at the Mountain Pass mine in California. There are processing facilities in Texas in particular, as well as small national labs that are starting to try and rebuild this expertise. And then lastly, and I guess I'll leave the Japan example to the Q&A if it comes up, but just updated 1 minute ago live. So we are potentially starting to pursue some more multilateral or bilateral efforts to diversify supply here with Australia, which very much emulates how Japan responded to their crisis in 2010. I'll wrap up right there. Thank you.
So it's wonderful you ended on that point, because I was going to make two comments and ask one question. And I'm killing a little time here because I want you all to prepare your own questions. We have 30 minutes for discussion now. So great job keeping on track here to save time for discussion. The first comment I was going to make was we haven't talked much about Korea and Japan. And I think they are both really interesting countries to study in these domains as well. And so feel free to comment a little more if you want to. You know, I would say Japan got overly seduced by hybrids and has been trying to squeeze every last drop of profit out of hybrids and really held themselves back from advancing to pure battery electric vehicles. But Korea has been a very interesting story, not so much state-led, but very entrepreneurial-led in terms of, I mean, if you look at what Hyundai's done, it's kind of an interesting story. And so we could dig into that a little bit. The other comment I wanted to make is just noting that across all of these examples that we've talked about, the strategy of vertical integration and local content requirements in China is quite robust. And I've also done a lot of work on the solar industry in China. And when I was there in 2010, I was really shocked by two things: automation and vertical integration. The whole strategy at the time was to completely automate the plants, And then secondly, to vertically integrate, because they did not like their supply chain vulnerability. And they had already figured that out in 2010. So very early. The question I wanted to ask all of you is to comment on China's global strategy. I was recently in Mexico and was shocked that all of the taxis in Mexico City are no longer the cute little VW bugs that they used to be. They're all BYDs. And I couldn't believe that because I thought it would be an American company, right? It's Mexico supplying the taxis for Mexico City. So it was just a little, it was like a little shocker, but it was also very interesting, consistent with your data about Latin American exports.
I can show you another slide.
Yeah, so I know you're going to have something
Yeah.
to say about this. And you mentioned China looking for higher margins outside of China, but I'd like you each to talk about what do you think is China's global strategy? And maybe if you can, and Elaine, I'm looking at you, maybe comment especially on how the US compares in terms of global strategy. So let me just put that question on the table. Maybe start with Ilaria.
Could I have my slides back up? Sorry, I don't know how complicated that is, but could I have the clicker? Just because I have.
And then we're going to go to Q&A. So get your questions ready.
So I think, interesting just sort of to point out, right? We're seeing over the past 2 years, we've seen actually an impact in emerging markets in their sales rates, right? So I think, you have the comparison here with China, so everybody else looks like they're doing nothing. But look at where the US is, or even the European Union. I apologize, that's not updated. So it's about 23% in the year to date for the European Union. And then look at all those emerging markets. No one thought there was a market for EVs in any of those countries. And so no automaker, well, I should say actually Hyundai has a little bit of a strategy in Indonesia, for example, but a lot of those are made in Indonesia, but exported. So 60% of the EV today, the EVs made in Indonesia by Hyundai are actually for the export market. But, they're selling some in Indonesia. But basically nobody else really considered these markets worth it because they're very small, right? And so this is the sales rate. And, if you look at something like Indonesia, it's maybe 800 vehicles, passenger vehicles sold a year, so 800,000. Compare that to the US, that's peanuts, right? But at the country level, it's transformational, right? So it's actually having quite an impact in both their industry and their sales. And I think if you look at these companies, right, this is Mexico. Mexico is like fascinating because they actually had, they removed tariffs on EVs and then they reintroduced them because of pressure from the US. And the jump in BYD sales has been after the tariffs were reintroduced, right? And I think that just tells you how thirsty companies like BYD are for new markets. But it's entirely transformational.
But also how thirsty those
countries
are.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Mexico is really interesting because Mexico has actually the largest EV production of any emerging market, but all that production goes north of the border to the United States. Those are very expensive cars that the average Mexican is not going to be able to buy. Right? So there's a few Teslas that get sold in Mexico. They're very expensive. And in fact, sometimes the EVs that are made in Mexico are priced higher in Mexico than in the United States, because that's really sort of the strategy. And so they're importing they're making EVs, selling them to the US, and then they're importing all these cheap EVs from China, which by the way, mirrors exactly what's happening in the internal combustion engine vehicle market, right? So this is not unique to EVs. This is happening also in ICE vehicles, and often it's even like, GM, for example, makes sort of cheap ICE vehicles in China for the Mexican market. And so I think this is sort of the interesting trend that you see again, it's mostly BYD, right? All these markets, they're just buying Chinese EVs, right? And you can see this mirrored across multiple industries. Now, what's interesting, sorry, I'll stop, but is that a lot of these markets have introduced tariffs. Sorry, I don't know. But they have introduced tariffs, and that's because they are concerned about their industry and they want Chinese investment. So that's actually globalizing the Chinese industry even more, and it's bringing them to a lot of other countries. Mexico's not going to get a BYD factory. I'm pretty confident about that. But look at other countries and you see it happening. And so they're globalizing very quickly, and I think that's the strategy. But I think
Brazil has, I think, accepted 3, right?
And there's at least 2 that have been built.
Because when I was in Brazil,
yeah.
that was the talk of the.
Yeah, and Thailand has multiples, et cetera, and Indonesia also has multiple. But I will just say, this is at some point going to create some conflict. You have now export controls on batteries, right? There's very clear strategies for economic security that China wants to keep certain types of technologies in China. But these countries want localization. And so there's going to be tension there. And then in addition to that, there's a ton of exports from China. Now these companies are building factories outside of China. Some of those factories are going to be exporting from those countries elsewhere. It's going to be creating conflict between Chinese workers or workerless factories in China and factories elsewhere. And so I think that's sort of like an interesting trend to keep an eye on. But it's very nascent, so we don't really know where it's headed. I'll stop there. Sorry.
Elaine,
Let
go
me
ahead.
touch on Mexico and then talk about Chinese strategy. So Mexico makes lots of vehicles for the US market. In Mexico, even 5-10 years ago, imported most of the vehicles for the Mexican market. And they used to be coming dominantly from India back in like 2019. So one thing to think about is emerging market demand for EVs is those EVs are not necessarily the ones sold here. So in 2021 and 2022, maybe even 2023, the number one selling EV in China was the EV50. It's a GM Wuling SAIC joint venture. It's the size of a smart car. If any of you remember, it's an A car. It's like smaller than anything else sold in the US market. It has about 100 miles of range. It's like a street legal golf cart. It would never really make it in this US market, but it's perfect for emerging market sales where people have lower budgets, accept smaller cars, and don't need as much range. The US is like kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum globally in terms of wanting the biggest cars and the most range just because of our geography and where we rely on our cars. So Brazil and Thailand are examples of countries with really high tariff walls that generally their market has been served by domestic production, even by internationals. So let's talk about Chinese strategy. So as some of you will know, China kind of sets strategic guidance from the top in the central government, and then the provinces go out and try to execute it in varied ways. And so in, I believe, 2019, it arose the discussion of dual circulation. So we're not only going to try to produce for export, but we're going to try to develop this domestic market where export was the long-standing objective. And I think it's worth noting that even the private companies that are private auto companies in provinces are not necessarily as private as a private company would be here. So there are many forms of government support. It could be, I gave you the land and I built your plant for you. Generally private companies or large private companies have party members on their board in recent years. So there's this gray area. But I think there is this huge shakeout happening in the auto industry. I think, Kelly, you said something like there had been 600 firms. They're now down to maybe about 100. But I don't think this is necessarily central strategy, but these firms are fighting to be a survivor. They don't have banks that would actually call their loans and put them into bankruptcy. So any revenue is good revenue. And so some of this deep discounting and credit below cost sales within China that the government has called out as counterproductive to good products in their industry, and the sales overseas are not brand strategy from the Chinese government, but companies just trying to get any revenue to survive a little longer and see if they can make it.
And in fact, the prices are often higher abroad than they are in China.
In fact, when I've looked at individual models and I've taken like an individual model sold in China and sold in Europe, the price is 2x. And that was before the tariffs, before the EU started imposing tariffs.
And even if you look at countries like Brazil, right, emerging markets, they're still selling from a lot higher than they would in China. We're not talking about $10,000 vehicles in Brazil. We're talking about like $30,000. So I think it's that's significant. Sorry.
Do you want me to respond?
I do, because I think you have a lot to say that's relevant.
So Really, really briefly on the Chinese international strategy and raw materials is there has been Chinese companies have gone out and pursued resource extraction in other countries. A lot of sometimes that's your greenfield investment, but a lot of it is buying shares in existing mining projects, which are often very, very internationally diverse in their ownership portfolios, right? So like 20 investors from 20 different countries will have shares in an Australian mine, something like that. So it is not a clear cut, right? China owns this, China owns that. There's much more of what China has been doing. There's bringing in raw materials for processing and more of the higher value added processes within China. So for example, cobalt from the DRC coming to China and then being used in China or re-exported. There's also been preferential pricing policies where you can get these materials far cheaper if you are operating in China. And that was part of this an earlier, certainly like the 2000s, 2010s, trying to attract higher tech investment and things like batteries and whatnot to China. And that was a lot of that was quite successful. But I actually think that thinking about the United States as an international strategy is more interesting here, that there has been quite a bit of effort from the United States and partners to diversify together in critical minerals. So right now we have the Mineral Security Partnership that is doing these joint activities abroad in the Biden's Indo-Pacific IPEF. There were critical minerals as one of the pillars there. The G7 also has within economic security has a specific critical mineral language. There are, by my count, about 15 of these international initiatives to try and diversify critical minerals together. Different countries have been doing different stages of this. Korea's really been investing in building expertise abroad and like the very early exploration stages. Japan has been more involved in financing the initial mining and processing stages abroad, and particularly with Australia. And the United States has more been involved because the United States is a very resource abundant country, to try and attract talent here and to bring in, for example, Australian expertise in order to build our own domestic supply chains. So there is a lot of international work, and it's happening, despite all the initiatives, in many ways, it's happening in a very piecemeal way.
Yeah, we just finished a paper that hasn't come out yet, comparing the DRC, cobalt in the DRC with nickel in Indonesia. And I was really interested to learn that history because, you know, the US firms used to own a lot of the cobalt production and gradually sold that all off. And of course, who bought it but the Chinese, right, over time. And Indonesia has sort of has learned from China, just impose local content requirements, requiring refining of nickel in Indonesia. So we're starting to see, and I think this is a very important point that Ilaria raised, these other major emerging economies want their own green growth strategies and green jobs, and they're starting to think about, well, what can we learn from what China has done? Especially, I think they're very interested in the China story and how they can start harnessing some of these economic gains. So let's open it up. Who has a question? Go to the microphones, and great, we've got 3. So let's start with you. Please, quick introduction of yourself and brief question.
Absolutely. I'm Bethany Russell. I'm a joint degree student between the Kennedy School and the Business School. And I wanted to push a little on what U.S. auto policy should be, because the U.S. is a late second mover in this sector. And I think that matters a lot. And that creates a sense of urgency that I don't really feel out of our policies. We not only need to compete, but we need to catch up and then compete. Additionally, we're facing a lot of headwinds in this sector. We don't have the same manufacturing industrial base we can draw off of. We don't have the same supply chain dominance, so we'll need to invest in supply chains as well. There's the timing issue. We need to change consumer behaviors around EVs, and we can't dump the same amount of money into competition in EVs that China has been able to. So kind of given all of these headwinds and the fact that we're a second mover, what does a competitive industrial policy look like? Is it copying China's model, trying to stimulate supply and demand and hoping like the free market and competition will kind of catch up? Is it picking a national champion and maybe doubling down on Tesla and like investing in their supply chains to try to compete with BYD? Is it exiting the market entirely and relying on allies like Germany or Japan to, create EVs, and maybe the US just invest in like the supply chain part of it? So how do you see like an effective and competitive industrial policy in auto?
That's a question for Elaine.
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, like if you wanted a climate policy on EVs, first of all, you'd be like, let them all in. But that does miss some of the other concerns and arguments, especially around the national security argument. So first of all, I would argue we're a third mover, because Europe is well ahead of the US in terms of EV share of sales and sort of that adoption. And they've used the sticks of demanding using regulatory policy to demand adoption more heavily. We've just pulled those off. Those are pretty powerful. Those just say the automakers, okay, well, this share of your vehicles by this year need to be EVs. And the Trump administration has pulled off or zero rated the fuel economy penalties for not having a fuel efficient enough fleet. Said California can no longer have tougher emission standards and other states can't follow it because they're not, and that it's on track to take away emission standards. Those are actually really sort of cheap policies from public dollars that drive towards it. I think that, battery chemistry and research in battery chemistry is incredibly important, because with battery chemistry, you can diversify away from some of your most difficult to get elements. So for example, zero cobalt or low cobalt batteries. Sodium ion is a candidate for next generation. We got lots of sodium. We have lots of lithium too, by the way. Yeah. We have tons of lithium. I also think that this demand for stuff, though, this is where maybe you don't need them as industrial policy. The demand for these elements is just yielding lots of discoveries. It takes a while to extract, but that's addressable. So that's why I'm saying target these things. I would say a couple things. No national champion. Lots of people can charge at home, and we're making a lot of progress on the road network that is important to people's willingness to adopt. And historically, a year ago, I thought that allied production and allied, was just fine. But I think we've discovered that we can make our leadership can make decisions to change those relationships. The Trump administration has really chosen to use economic statecraft and possibly defense policies against our traditional allies. So we're changing the nature of our alliances. Others can do it too, and I don't know if that's as good a strategy as it was before. Diversification is always good, but I just have questions around there that I haven't fully answered.
Okay, let's go to our next question. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name is Zihua. I'm a PhD student at the TH Chan School of Public Health. So my question is that only one hand that China has heavily invested in auto and the critical mineral mining industries, but in a form of subsidy and state support, like cheaper land for factory, like cheap cost for building factory, and many other type of support to both industries. But on the other hand, that so many investment into these type of industries that many times cause corporate or companies to overbuild or oversupply their products and causing a lot of overcapacity. And many of these type from actually BYD actually fall into debt trap already in recent years, and it's getting worse and worse because they are no longer selling more EVs to domestic market or foreign markets. So what's your comment on this, and So I was, especially because this type of approach is more like state planning. But we are in US, right? US is a market-driven economy, I would say. Do you think like state planning is like on the upwing now in terms of, this type of economy?
Okay, great. Who wants to take that
I'll
one?
take
Go
that
ahead,
one.
yeah.
So one of the big important questions with approaching industrial policy is a political question. It's not an economic question. And the political question is, this is important for national security or national prosperity. And one of those things, and those are two different things, and you can measure them in different ways, but they have to be decisions that are made. And if we say, yes, these having domestic sources of electric vehicles, being able to make them, like the whole supply chain here, or having rare earths so they can't be a tool of foreign coercion is, and we can build our fighter jets and whatnot, are a matter of national security. That's a political decision that's made and that in some ways accepts that you are going to have failures, you're going to have deep inefficiencies, you might have overcapacity, you might even have state capture. So it's a decision that needs to be made very cautiously, and we see all of those pathologies in China, absolutely. And it's easier to celebrate the successes because many of them, like BYD cars, are super cool. But we also do have those pathologies, and so it's a political decision that needs to be taken with eyes wide open and a willingness to accept both failure and cost.
Okay, I want to take these last three questions. We're going to hear each of your questions, and then we'll do one more round of responses because we're was asked to end a little early. So I want to make sure we
Thank you.
get all the questions in.
My name is Carlo. I'm an Italian student at the Kennedy School. My question is the following: like when we talk about industrial policy, we always talk about West versus China. And in the past, it made more sense for Europe to collaborate with the US in terms, let's say, of economic advantage. But when it comes now, and we have a partner that puts tariffs that really want to be confrontational with us, and it doesn't advance the sustainability goals, why for Europe at the moment should be an advantage to collaborate with US instead with China when it comes to automotive, when it comes to critical minerals, etc. Thank you.
Great. Let's take this question, then we'll come back to the man right behind you. Yeah.
Hi,
Go ahead.
my name's Andreas. I'm a master's student at the Fletcher School. My question was around the dark factories and automation. We heard a lot about the benefits through efficiency, but I was wondering if you could touch on some of the risk either to economic security or national security that this poses. Thank you.
Okay, great. And then if you would just step to the side and let the person behind you.
Hi,
Great.
Mark Thomas, I'm a student at the law school. There was a brief mention about the idea of leapfrogging potentially, and arguably the next frontier for vehicles is autonomous vehicles. So I was curious if you could comment on the kind of state of play in terms of competition of autonomous vehicles, and to what like how deep in the tech stack that goes. It's mostly software, but there is some hardware, and sort of what you see the future.
Great. I'm glad you asked that because that was in the title of the talk and we hadn't really gotten to autonomous vehicles. Okay, let me ask each of you to comment on whatever you want based on those last three questions. Ilaria, let's start with you.
I guess I'll take the EU, having originally being from Italy as well. I actually think what's interesting that's happening in the EU, it's actually a sort of an interesting laboratory that the US should be looking carefully at because there's a lot of Chinese investment in Europe. There's a huge debate in Europe over whether this is beneficial and not. And in a way, I think we've probably seen the peak of Chinese EV and battery investment in Europe. And now it's a question of how it gets managed, right? And how much the EU can actually sort of get more localization. So I think the idea that the EU is following the US is probably not correct, right? It's taking another pathway. But that pathway may or may not tie it closer to China, right? And I think that's because the automotive sector in Europe is just different, has very different ties to China, and then also geopolitical relationship is also different. So I think that's just sort of worth keeping an eye on. I think worth for everybody to keep an eye on these topics. Dark factories and risk to national security, super interesting question. I mean, I think everybody usually asks the impact on labor, which is significant. I think in general, even when we talk about connected vehicles, right? There's a connected vehicle rule in the United States. But my concern isn't necessarily, I understand that there's a risk from China, I accept that. But to me, the risk overall is more about cybersecurity, right? And I think we're just going to see this across the board as everything gets sort of more smart. I think that's just something that we should have better sort of more national security regulation or provisions for, right? So I think that's something to keep in mind. I'll say one last thing on leapfrogging. But I think, actually partners, I think, Kelly, you mentioned earlier the role of Japanese and Korean companies. These are the leading companies in battery technology outside of the United States. And I think there's sort of an interesting question of, the US has excellent labs and innovation, but usually the piece that's been missing is that commercialization. So I think thinking a lot more about what is missing, right? Is it financing? Do we need better tools that allow sort of companies at early stages to then mature and become greater? Or is there something where like existing companies need more innovation in certain segments, right? And so I think just thinking through that would probably be helpful. And I think, I agree with Elaine that batteries are the strategic element here, right? EVs, whatever, everybody can sort of make a shell of a car, right? But the batteries is sort of actually crucial and has a lot of other applications as well. It's up there.
Okay, I'm not convinced dark factories are the way to go for any reason. I think that's an open question. There is the cybersecurity issue, but there are other issues. There's certain jobs that robots are really good at, like inspection, actually. They're really careful, they're really thorough, they never miss stuff. But when the machine's down, you can't call in another worker, like when one's sick. That's one issue. Also, a lot of this dark factory has to do with assembly with fewer parts. So, and Tesla's gone that direction a lot too. So if the entire body is one part and you have a fender bender, are you going to replace the whole part? And one thing that's happening is insurance claims are getting much higher for repairs of certain vehicles. Teslas are the epitome in this country, and they get totaled at a much higher level, which is going to drive up insurance costs. So sort of like there's a whole thing that hasn't been worked out as if that's the way to go in terms of assembly with fewer parts and whether dark factories are suitable. On AV and ADAS, or driver assistance systems, I think the US and China are leaders. I don't think Europe's anywhere on that. I think China's a lot more forgiving about testing and things going wrong than in the US, where, if the accident rate of an autonomous vehicle is vastly lower than that of humans, but there is one visible thing, there's a lot of backlash, and I'm happy to have a sidebar about this.
Mm-hmm. We hear a lot from countries in Southeast Asia. Please don't make us choose between the United States and China. We'd like to go both ways. And I think that if we think about this question of cooperation from Europe with the US versus China or Japan, South Korea, et cetera, it's the same thing. Like this is a very, very unwelcome choice. We have very long histories of cooperation, both security and economic cooperation with Europe, with Japan, with the United States as traditional allies. That is something that can be squandered, and it's something that we could find a lot of strength from in this position. But the question of, as I wrote it down, why should Europe collaborate with the United States and not China? And I'll push back at that question and say, why should Europe have to choose? And right, what kinds of goals, what kind of future are we looking for? Are we looking for a climate policy? Are we looking for a national security policy? We have very different answers and very different policy recommendations depending on what that end goal is. So that I think is where we should start.
Fantastic. This has been an extremely rich panel, and I want to thank the three of you for bringing so much content and insight to the discussion, and thank all of you for hanging in there. We're now going to transition to our next speaker, so there's no break, but you might want to stand up and stretch. Is that okay, Chris? And then we're going to have my good friend, Brian Deese, speaking, I think, in conversation with Chris. So thanks again for this.
Look at this in the flesh.